Howard Hendricks used to say something about the mind can consume only what the behind can stand. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. At a certain point, you know, you start doing this and you can't hear what's going on here. I'll try to be short and sweet. I just might mention a couple of things about my books back there. The one that hasn't had much attention is the one From God to Us. And in many ways, I think that's one of my best books because it chronicles really the meaning of how to interpret and translate the scriptures. And it goes along with a number of the evaluation of some of the study Bibles. I think study Bibles are very important. They're starting to take the place of commentaries, but I think they can also be dangerous in that you begin to rely only on the notes and don't read the text. You want to know immediately what it means. So that book kind of deals with all of that. And I was just telling some of them the book on my novel on the life of Paul has gone out of print. They haven't taken bankruptcy, but they've quit printing. So they've told me that it goes out of print as of January the 1st. So I've got till then to buy the files from them and get somebody else to print it. Mm-hmm. This is a problem with a lot of these small publishers. They're just really having a hard time now making it because of all this things that are going on and online and everything. So I hope paper books don't go out of style, but they may someday. Mm. Even paper ones now, if they're translated and read aloud, they are very very popular. People like to plug them in their car when they're driving. They can listen to them. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'd like to do on some of them if I can decide which one would be appropriate for that. But it's very costly. It's very hard to translate that. I don't mean translate, I mean to read it. And to read it accurately using voice control for different characters and things. It's a long process. So. But it's, I think it's worthwhile because that's the way people are learning. Mm-hmm. I still like to have something in my hand, although I read a lot of news on my phone in the morning, but I like to have a book in my hand so I can thumb through the pages. So anyway, my title today, I wasn't sure what to do with all of this, so I call it From Hobby to Heritage, the evolution of Bible collecting. I think this is probably a process that most of us will go through or have gone through. We began as hobbyists and we end up as wanting it to be our heritage and wanting it to be used by many others. So that's sort of what I want to talk about a little bit. The Bible has been a vital part of my life for over 79 years. My first Bible was given to me by my beloved grandmother, Agnes Brake. At Christmas in 1945, she gave me a red letter New Testament. And though I didn't appreciate it at the time, I was only 6 years old, so I didn't really appreciate it much, but I still have it. And red letter editions are special in my heart, simply because of my beloved grandma. And my grandma was very poor. They came from a very poor thing, but everybody called her Ms. Brake, Ms. Brake. Because she had a presence about her that was very, very astute. She had her white hair always up in buns and had an air of dignity that is not often associated with poor people. And so Ms. Brake was even all of her in-laws all the way through, Ms. Brake. It was never Agnes, it was always Ms. Brake. I probably didn't even know her name was Agnes until I was much older. But Louis Kloppish is the first one to do, from the Christian Herald magazine in 1899, did the first red letter edition of the Bible, and that was the New Testament. And then in 1901, he did the full New Testament. I was asked several years ago, when did they first do red letter editions? And I didn't even know, so I finally found out where it was, and knowledge, as you pointed out. So my next encounter with the Bible was 64 years ago. And I think I may have told this story in one of my books, so if you've read it, you've heard it before. I entered the small Christian bookstore in this little picturesque town of Shelbyville, Illinois. And a sense of, by the way, that's where the last ice glacier, if there's more than one, some believe there's only one, but that's where it ended, in Shelbyville, Illinois, of all places. And I entered into this bookstore with a great deal of excitement and adventure in my mind, because several days prior to that, Carol and I had, Carol started working right after we were married, started working for a jeweler. And so she was a captive to a Christian, Methodist Christian guy that the whole town thought he was a little fanatical because he believed that Jesus was the Savior of the world and he wanted to tell everybody. So my wife started working for him, and he would talk to her every day about the Lord and listen to Christian broadcasting all the time. And my wife remembers at one point where she was keeping track of his money, and Back to the Bible was a broadcast many years ago, and she heard this program, and they were asking for a contribution. And his name was Ellsworth Platt. So Mr. Platt said to my wife, let's go ahead and send him a contribution. She said, you only have $25 in your bank account. He said, okay, good, send $25. But this was the man that, this was his motif. I mean, he was always giving. And as a result, God gave back. His jewelry business grew. They had to knock out the walls and build more places. Even after we left there, and he followed up always with us, sending us Bibles and books about the Bible. All the time we were missionaries. He was an avid supporter of us. And so he had the night before I entered into this bookstore, he had led Carol and I to the Lord. He had been talking to her. He said, now don't let, if you're, she said, I'm talking to Don about it. He said, now I'd like to come over and talk to you more personally about this. And so he said, now remember, as soon as I say that, the devil's going to attack you and Don and not going to let you do that. So she came home to me. She said, Mr. Platt would like to come over and talk to us about God. Well, I'd been hearing Carol talk about it, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. She said, he said that if you don't want to go, if you don't want to hear it, it's because the devil's going to get at you. And I said, well, I'm not afraid of that. And so, yeah, bring him on over. So he came over with this huge dispensational chart and went through all this theology. I didn't know what he was talking about. But he gets to the end of it and he says, you know, Don and Carol, you're going to face Jesus one day. Are you going to face him as judge or as Savior? And I thought, well, that's an easy question to answer. So we began that evening. We lay in bed and we were praying that we would accept Jesus as our Savior. And we did it for the next 2 or 3 nights because we wanted to make sure we said it right. So I'm going, he said, you've got to have a Bible. So we went into this Christian bookstore, and I went through all their sections of Bibles, and I found this really nice leather-bound Bible. Had some kind of rough edges on it, and it felt so good to my fingers, and I opened it up, and it was a Schofield Reference Bible. Well, our mentor said the Schofield Reference Bible is the best one, and so I took it up and I laid it on the counter, and I said, I want to buy this. And he said, now you want to know something? That's a Baptist Bible. A Baptist Bible? Oh, well, I said, I don't know what that means, but I know Mr. Platt wants me to buy this Bible. So he said, okay, and so I gave him the money, and I walked out. So that was really the beginning of a Bible and the Schofield Bible. And for many years, this was in 1960, and so for many years, that Schofield Bible was my constant companion. I loved the way it felt. I thought it was a holy book, and it had notes on it that would help explain it to me. And so Schofield Bible became a very important part of my life, especially in those early years before I got corrupted by seminary. Oh. And they began to say, well, maybe the King James Bible is not for you. So this was a really important time for me. And of course, because Schofield is so important to me, I had to collect the Schofield Bibles. So that's when my hobby began. I wanted to collect red letter editions, though I hadn't started that yet, but that was on my list of things to do. The Scofield Bible is probably the most influential Bible of the 20th century for evangelicals. I mean, it really penetrated the market for evangelicals. And the one that I like most, and I still like it today, is the 1967 edition. I think it's the best translation of the King James Bible ever, because it has not taken all of the these and thous out, which sometimes are important because there's a difference between plurals, whereas we use the word you for everything now, except in Texas we say you, we say y'all, and we say y'all, all y'all. So that means everybody. So it's not just y'all, it's all y'all. Anyway, I think the Scofield Bible did some of those things that were not very understandable. For instance, baked meat. Baked meat means baked pie, a meat pie. I always think of mincemeat pie, which I hated passionately, but that's what I always think when I think baked meat. That can't be something good. Botch, we use the word botch, but it really means boil. And minish, which really means diminish. And ouch means setting. So when I sit up and say ouch, it's because I've been sitting too long, I guess. So anyway, there's a lot of these words that the Scofield Bible changed that didn't really change the King James Version in my estimation. So I think it's really a good update of the King James Version.
So I have one question.
Yeah.
So are you saying that the King James was changed in those specific situations?
Yes, they changed the words.
Okay.
They changed the words to a modern word.
Oh, they did.
Like superfluity and naughtiness. That's not a phrase we use very often, but that's in the King James.
Okay, yeah.
And so they changed that. It's things like that.
Yeah.
That a lot of the modern King James versions do change. The 21st century King James and some of those change those words and go too far. I think the New King James went too far with some of those too. But the translators some of them were anti-King James translators, so you can kind of expect that. So my pursuit of the Scofield Bibles, of course, I now have all of the editions, of course, and they're not for sale. It's part of me. So in the year 1966, before my father passed away, it really made a big impression on my understanding of Bible translations. He carried a Slim Jim pocket New Testament in his coat pocket, in his side coat pocket every Sunday. He'd go and hold that out there and maybe take it out of his pocket, maybe not, but then come home at night, come home from church and lay it up on the dresser, and there it would stay until the next Sunday. And so in 1966, about a year before he passed away, I was engrossed in seminary, and I was learning all these things about literal translations and the new translations, which were the NIV, the ASV, 1901 ASV, and the 1951 edition of the Revised Standard. Those were the times that they said, well, you have to have a literal translation. So I go home, we tried to go back home as often as we could. And so on this particular occasion, we went there, and my dad, we were sitting down just chatting, and my dad said, I was given a copy of a New Testament called Good News for Modern Man. And I'm thinking in my mind, oh no, Dad's getting off on the wrong foot here. And he said, for the first time, I realized that the Bible is for me to read. My father had an 8th grade education. While it did not keep him from rising in ranks in his factory as a worker, from a foreman onto a supervisor, he was limited in what he could read. And the King James Bible was hard for him to read. And he said he's reading, and he said, for the first time, I realized that I can understand the Bible. Because he had always thought that you go to church to have the pastor tell you what the Bible means. Well, you can imagine, my heart was strangely warmed, as Wesley would say. All of a sudden I realized, wow, what a testimony. Here I'm thinking of this highfalutin translating Greek and Hebrew, and here my father, who I love dearly, is learning to read Good News for Modern Man, which has a vocabulary, I believe, of 600 words. So he could actually understand it. And so it really changed my idea about the importance of Bibles. Then in about 1970, in the early 70s, I was in charge of the Bible school in Ethiopia at Sodu, where I was in charge of the Bible school. And no, this was when I was in Jimma, sorry. And I was in charge of the library and selling books in the bookstore for these people. And most of them were in Amharic. There were a few books in Amharic. There were some English, but most of them were Amharic. And so we had a stack of Amharic Bibles, and this fellow came in and he said, I want to buy 5 Amharic Bibles. And I kind of chided him, laughing at him. I said, why do you want 5 Bibles? You only have a wife and infant children. He said, because the Derg is going to take control of Ethiopia. This was during the revolution. And he says, we're going to bury those in a plastic bag so that we will have a Bible when my kids get older. What it showed to me was the value they placed on God's Word, that they were going to have it buried so that they'd have it once the Derg took control. And they did take control as during that period. And we had to face a lot of persecution and things. They were burning Bibles and tearing up Bibles and all that sort of thing. So it was the administration. They were a Marxist-Lenin group that got control, but they lost the battle about 1986. They were run out, and they came back to the original form. All of our Bible schools, we had 13 district Bible schools. They were all destroyed, and when we came back, they rebuilt all of those. And I was there about, I think I've told some of you, but about 5 years ago, I went back to that same place where that school was. A seminary now is in Sodu, and I went back there and I preached in 2 different churches, both of them about 8,000 in each one of those services in the same town. So, and I met a lot of my students and even the grandchildren of my students. So it was quite a thrill to see that something I did lasted at least a little bit of time. So the idea is that Bibles were becoming very important to me, not just the collecting of them, but the words of them. And I always say, we don't worship the Bible. We worship the God of the Bible. So if someone takes the Bible and throws it across the floor, I know they say, well, it didn't matter because it's just a Bible. But there's a respect that belongs with the Bible. And I was growing a healthy respect for the Bible. And so by this time now, I would say a bibliophile is born. I was thinking about what you said. A colleague of mine said, you know what a bibliophile is? He says someone who buys a book that they already have. And I've done that too. And that's why you catalog yours.
Yep. Yeah. It will probably never stop.
Yeah. So about 44 years ago, in 1980, I was professor of Bible at Multnomah. At the time, it was called Multnomah School of the Bible. And I was teaching history courses, a lot about the history of the English Bible, history of lots of different kinds of history. And as a faculty, we met separately from the students. They went to the cafeteria, but we had our own little private room there. And we would have our lunches there, and as professors, we'd sit around and jawbone about theology, and we weren't being pestered by students all that time. So we enjoyed doing that. And one time I was reading a list of Bibles that I had been sent to from Nelson's Book Room in England. And there were a number of books on there, and 2 of them, one of them was a 1597 Geneva and a 1569 Bishop's Bible. And so I thought, you know, I told my colleague Ed Goodrick about this. Ed was one that did the concordance for the NIV. And so he and I were always talking about Bibles and stuff like translation work and all that. And I said, you know, what do you think? Should I get these? Oh, yeah, you should get them. He was so enthusiastic. Of course, not his money, it's mine, right? But he was so enthusiastic. You know, you got to have them. He said they'll make great pieces to show and tell in your class. So I said, okay, they're about $300 a piece, which was just a decent price. And now you can't buy them for that. But so I sent off for them and bought these 2 Bibles, and I got them. Waited anxiously, I guess, for about 3 weeks or something, and took that long to get there. So we get these books, And boy, the first thing I do, I got with Ed, and we went down to his house in his basement where he did all of his work, had all of his books. He had a small Bible collection, not a big one, a small one. And so we got out these books and started going through them and investigating and reading them and trying to, well, we discovered that the 1569 Bishop's Bible was really a 1569 Great Bible, which is the last great Bible ever printed. So, I'm thinking, oh man, did I make a deal, right? So I've often said later that he may have just done that as a little bait for me because he knew that I would end up buying a lot more from him. So that was really, I consider that to be my beginning of my Bible collection because that's when I really got interested in it. And so I decided at that point that I wanted to get all of the major Bibles that were in the history of the English Bible. I didn't care if it was first edition. I didn't even think about that. I was only wanting to get something to show students and for my own self to see how it's been handled all the way through. So I spent a lot of time just buying any kind of copy I could find. And then, of course, they start seeing better copies and first editions, and then, I'm hooked. I'm a bibliophile at that point. So, I like to call this the anatomy of a Bible collector. So I began collecting these that talk about the the history of the English Bible, but I also was very interested in knowing where they got what they did. And so I had to begin to study Bibles in Greek and Hebrew. Well, the Old Testament was not as important to me as New Testament, so I really spent my time thinking in terms of the Greek text of the New Testament and what texts were used when they translated this Bible and this Bible. So that began my journey in trying to add to my English collection, because by this time I was getting a lot of English things and I wasn't being very disciplined. I wanted to go a little bit beyond that, so I started with some of the Greek texts that I found. And so going through lists, and David Lockman gave me, I was getting lists from him from the early 80s, just these 2 or 3 whole pages like this, no spaces in between, crammed in there like this. And so I would go through those and started buying things. Well, I wanted to also I was very interested in textual criticism, so I wanted to start buying those too. And David always had a lot of those, and so did Nelson's book room in London. So I was getting a lot of things like that. And I spent a lot of time going to Europe and to England on my limited budget, but I got to go pretty regularly. So I was spending a lot of time chasing through hunting things. In fact, as most of you may know, that my first book on a visual history of the English Bible came out from my wife, who at one point, after making all these things, she said, you've got to start writing that down for your kids, because what you have is pretty important. And so she said, you need to write all that down, and the adventures and how you found those things, because everybody's asking me, where do you find these things? How did you get that? Where did you find that? So I started putting all these things together for my kids, and a literary agent found one of those. I was talking to him in my office one day, and he said, you really need to get those published. So we put them together, and we had Baker agreed to publish it, and they did. And that was that year. It was the only time that Baker ever had a starred review in one of the major magazines. The only time they ever had it. And it was also nominated for Book of the Year. And I lost out, and you might guess what it was. The New Bible Version. This is what happens when I speak. I can't remember things. What's the latest English version that everybody likes?
ESV.
Right?
ESV.
Yes, ESV. ESV beat me out for first place on Book of the Year. So I will admit, that's it. Yeah, I will admit they're better. So anyway, that was the kind of the story behind that book. But my desire to go to Wales was overwhelming, because Les Walker owned Nelson's bookstore, and I wanted to go over there because I was getting a lot of lists from him. I was buying a lot of things from him. He would send me Christmas gifts to because I was helping support his life. And so I would get these Christian, and so I got this growing desire to go to Wales and to meet him, because he couldn't sell anything locally. He had to send everything away. He had to mail everything, so it was only for mail. So after I had gone through all of his shelves, he had a room about this size, and all the shelves were full of books, all up and down full of books. Of course, he didn't have them all cataloged. His list didn't include a portion of what he had. So he let me go through. So all afternoon, I got there, probably 1 o'clock or something, I don't remember, but I spent all afternoon going through all these things. And all of a sudden I realized it's almost 7 o'clock. And I said, I've got to get going. And his wife and him said, oh no, you've got to stay with us all night. So now I thought they were being generous, but you know what? They were probably counting their shekels. No, they were very sweet people. So they insisted that I stay. So I went upstairs in their room. This house was built in 1776. Ironic, huh? 1776. So I went up in the bedroom upstairs, and here is this beautiful ivory fireplace. They said they found when they bought it, they found a quill among the ashes in this big fireplace, and a big 4-poster bed. And looking outside was beautiful green pasture with sheep out there. I mean, it was idyllic. And so the next morning, I came down after a vegetarian meal. I'm not a vegetarian, so I didn't really care for the vegetarian meal. But anyway, I enjoyed it. And so the next morning, I got up and came down this long winding staircase that they had. And they're playing this beautiful classical music. And it was just like heaven was opening up for me. And from that point on, I became a lover of classical music. And instead of some of the country music that Loretta Lynn and Willie Nelson, I was all of a sudden loving classical music. And Mozart became one of my favorites. So now it's Willie and Mozart, not just Willie and Loretta. So after I had looked all through his thing, he said, well, come on upstairs. I want to show you what I have not brought out. So I went up there, and I found a 1657 London polyglot. And so I got that from him, and several other things I found. It was just absolutely marvelous. I couldn't take them with me. He had to mail them to me. So about, I don't know, after I got home in several weeks, these arrived in a gunny sack. You know what a gunny sack is, you farmers? There's a big bag hanging out my front door full of books. I said, how in the world could he send things like that? So I went through those and just reveled over them. But he and I then really got this relationship going, and again, we had presents coming back and forth. And he died a few years ago, and it left a real big hole in my collecting, because that was so much fun. And he was so enthusiastic, and he would send me these letters and say, I have this, you get the first shot at it. So I had a lot of opportunities to buy things that probably others would have paid more for, but it was an exciting period of time. So, but the polyglots that I got sort of got me really into the computension polyglot. As I mentioned last night, that was the one I really wanted, the New Testament polyglot, computension. So at Dallas Seminary, I began to study Greek under Zane Hodges. Zane Hodges he was real strong on the King James Version, the text that underlies the King James Version, which he called the Byzantine text. And I began to study under him, and just sort of fell in love with the idea of the text that was underneath the King James Version. And then later, now his idea was to count manuscripts. So if you had a reading that you would, there's a variant reading, then you would count the number of manuscripts that had that reading and count the number of manuscripts that had that reading. There's something about that I didn't like, because that means you don't count the Latin readings, you count only Greek readings. So I didn't really like that. So some time ago, I fell under the influence of Maurice Robinson. And Maurice has a little different view of it. He believes in the Byzantine textual form, but he believes in textual criticism just like it's practiced in all other types of textual criticism. So that really got me interested in tracing the history of all of the Greek New Testaments and all the books about the textual criticism. So this is really where my hobby is becoming my heritage. Now I'm saying, you know, I want to preserve those things, because if I want to find a particular book on textual criticism historically, they're not available. So this is where I got quite a number from David Lockman over the years, as well as for Nelson's books room. So that became very important to me. Erasmus' text was my favorite because it was the first, and the 1522, of course, is the edition used by the King James Version and by Tyndale. The 1519 version was used by Luther in his edition. So I began to really like Erasmus, and I had to collect all of his folios, of course. And what he did was he translated, or he put everything together in Greek, but there's only, they used to say about 5 manuscripts, but now we believe there's about 10 that was used in his. But if he'd have found 20, they would have been the same, because most of the texts of that period were of the Byzantine type. So it's not really a hack on him that he only had 5, because that was just the common text that was floating around. So these texts became extremely important, and he translated, or everywhere he had a Greek text, he put it in there, but there were some that he didn't have. So there's several passages in the Gospels, small passages, and then the book of Revelation, where he back translated. He translated from Latin back into Greek. And so that's what you have to be careful when you read the last verses of Revelation, that you have to remember these have come from Latin. Now, in most cases, it's quite accurate, actually, but it's just a way he did it, because he didn't have any manuscripts that had that. As we know, Revelation's hard to find in any old book, because that's the first thing that disappears, the title page and the end of Revelation. And then Stephanus, I had to have Stephanus, because that is really the one that solidified the Textus Receptus, as they call it. And it was, as I mentioned before, it was the most beautifully typed of Greek font that ever was produced, and that's what most say about it. And of course, he was the first one ever to use verse divisions, the ones that we use. There were some verse divisions used earlier, but these are the ones that we use in the Bibles today. And then Beza, his addition to from 1565 to 1604, really popularized the Textus Receptus. He didn't introduce really anything new, but because of printing a lot of them, it became very popular, and so the text really took its form during that period. Beza was a Protestant of the Reformation and a real fine scholar. Then you have the Elzevir editions. In 1624, the first edition, the important edition is in 1633, because in that he says in Latin, translated from the Latin, the text which is now received by all. That's where they get the idea of Textus Receptus. So the Textus Receptus was not the 1550, it really was 1633. But we know that it's almost the same text as the 1550, so many refer to the 1550 as the received text, but it's actually not. Then you have Griesbach, his editions from 1774 to 1806. He's the first ones to develop the families, the Alexandrian family, the Western family, and the Byzantine family. So finally they decided that there's a way to take all these manuscripts and categorize them into these families, depending upon where they were being copied. And so he was the first one really to start doing that. And then you have the Lackman New Testament, which was done in 1831, which really broke ground for something that I don't like. And that is, instead of using the text and putting the variants in a textual apparatus, which most of them were doing, he took the variant that he thought was right and put it into the text. And so that was, I mean, that's a good textual critical way of doing it, but it's not good for understanding what the original text was. Excuse me, I'd much rather they put the variants in the text and let me decide, because the way we have our text today is eclectic. There's no manuscript that does our Greek text today. Nothing, because it's eclectic. If they choose this one here, they choose this one here, they choose this one here, they choose this one here. So I prefer to have something that was used, and then if there are variants, let's put them in the footnotes and then decide critically whether or not that is a better reading than the one that's there. But rather than put it in there, just see it as a possibility. So Lachman was very important. That was done in 1831. And then you have Tischendorf. Most of you remember Tischendorf because he's the one that is associated with the finding of Sinaiticus, the manuscript at St. Catherine's in the Sinai Peninsula. He was very important and was one of the first ones to publish critical editions in his 8 different editions. Then we have Westcott and Hort. Everybody knows about Westcott and Hort's Greek New Testament. They fell in, really believe that the Alexandrian text was the best text, that the others were in error, and so he followed really Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, although truth be told, you can find that he really used Vaticanus more than he did Sinaiticus. But Sinaiticus is more complete, so where he didn't have Vaticanus, he used the Sinaitic edition. Then Hermann von Soden. He's one of my favorites because that's a rare set of volumes of the Greek New Testament. He set up a system which had the K text, which was a version of the Byzantine text type, which he said was inferior. He believed that was an inferior text. The H text, which he said is a temporary designation for the Western type text. And most agree with that. But then his I text, which he called the Hesychian text, was most significant because he believed, again, that the Alexandrian text was the most important. That's the argument today. Is it the Alexandrian text or is it the Byzantine text? The critical editions and more translations today are based upon the critical text, whereas the King James Version is based on the Byzantine text. So that's basically the difference in many of the arguments that we have over those different versions. So he was very important. He still is important today because he has done more collation of manuscripts than anybody else ever has. Now there's an institute in England that's working on this now where they're computerizing all these texts. And so eventually they're going to be able to have a collation of everything. They're now collecting all manuscripts. Any Greek New Testament that I get, I send it to this big place in Germany where they're classifying it. And so my texts are in there as another text. They're just collecting them all, whether there's any differences in them or not. So someday they're going to have a text produced that they can actually say is a compilation of all of them. So that's good news and bad news, mostly good news. Then you have the Nestle-Aland text, which is the one that's today that we use. And I'm just going to skip over some of these. You know, the Maurice Robinson one, that's the one I really like personally. And then there's the Hodges one, and there's the SBL. The Society of Biblical Literature has a New Testament, and there are a bunch more that you probably aren't interested in. But by now, I want to collect all of these. I want to collect all of the editions of the Greek New Testament. I want to collect all of the books on the history of textual criticism. And so I've amassed all of these things, and they're all down in the museum. They're all buried down there in some of those shelves, but they're there. And that was really one of my goals. And I suppose if you'd say, which of my collections is really most complete, it's my Greek collection that's most complete. Even though I have all the first editions of the English Bibles, except of course for Tyndale and Coverdale and Wycliffe. Otherwise, I have all of those, but my Greek collection is really complete. The good thing about collecting Greek is you don't find very many bad copies. You know, with the English Bible, you're always missing something somewhere. That's not true of the Greek text. They're almost always intact. It's because nobody used them, I think. Anyway, they're there. So now I just want to end with talking about how it became for me a heritage. My collecting at this point was really a passion, became a passion and a pursuit of everything I could possibly find. And I had to preserve all of these for my heritage and for the fact that I didn't want to see all these things going to Japan. Investors, you know, I competed against the Japanese for a number of King James versions and a lot of other versions. I competed with the Japanese. In fact, I began to collate things from Japan because there were King James versions in Japan. So I wanted to keep them in America and preserve them. And so that's where I, back in 1989, I received a strange letter from John Helston describing his vision for a Bible museum. And my preoccupation with moving to Israel at that time to become president of the Institute of Holy Land Studies kind of delayed my response to him as to what I wanted to do with it. I didn't know if he was a kook or if he was serious, you know. You just get a letter out of the clear blue, you know, it's hard to know. But he invited me to join him to fulfill his dream. He knew of my collection and interest in the history of the Bible, and I was adding papyrus and ancient pottery and coins to my collection, and he wanted those for the ambiance to spread out the coins and the pottery and all that sort of thing. So I started collecting a lot of ancient coins while I was in Israel. And you remember when down from the hill from back of the Institute, when it would rain, it would wash away a lot of the topsoil, and I went down and found coins. And I probably had 100 that I found, small widow's mites, little tiny things, and I found some very interesting ones. I even had an Alexander coin, which is very valuable. They're silver and they're very valuable. I can't find it.
Oh.
I know where most of them are, but that one I can't find yet. So anyway, John wanted me to join him, and he had some displays at the Fort Worth Public Library and Southwestern Baptist Seminary and the Biblical Arts Center. So his dream was really to have a permanent display somewhere or a traveling display. And the last time I talked to John, he felt that the Bible Museum in Washington was kind of a fulfillment of his dream, because he couldn't do that. He saw that as what, if he had a dream, that's what it would be like. And I think that was very magnanimous for him to say something like that. He's not jealous of that, because they have all of that. We didn't have it, but he saw that as a fulfillment of his dream. So that was always very impressive about John. So John and I met at Denny's restaurant, and we established a nonprofit organization called the Living Word National Bible Museum. John had already applied and been accepted to a 501c. So he was president and I was vice president, and that followed we set up a display of all places, the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History. And right behind our display was what do you call it, a number of skulls that represented evolution right behind our collection. I thought, here's a battle going on here. So that celebrated the 500th year of the birth of William Tyndale. That was in 1994. And then John enlisted Charles Paramore. He was an artist, and he created a mock-up of an interactive Bible museum. It had hand-painted pictures of period rooms and the people. It was advertised as the father of the English Bible. And we had recording of the kind of things that John Wycliffe said. And following our major exhibit, which was at the Biblical Arts Museum in Dallas, that was one of my favorite times of all, because I got to go down there regularly and lead people through the museum and showing and telling them all the stuff about it. What an opportunity to tell people about Jesus, because I would go into these different Bibles. I'd go into the Luther display and I'd say something about Luther, and it gave me an opportunity to say what Luther believed about things. And so it was kind of a fun time to be able to share the gospel with the people who are coming in there. John's brother did the life-size Gutenberg press. Someone was asking me about that. We took the plans that his brother had drawn up and sent them over to Mainz, Germany, where they have a major Gutenberg press there, not the original, but a replica. And they sent it back and said that they thought ours was better representative than theirs. They used steel and we used wood. And so that was kind of a compliment. And John's brother built that whole thing, and John was very proud of that. Everywhere he went, he talked about that. So that was an important part of our display. And we were at Branson, Missouri. We spent there quite a bit of time. We didn't know until later that we should not have charged anything. We charged, we had a fee, I mean, it's almost zero. But if it's free, they bring all the senior bus tours there. And then you have a donation, and they say you get more in donation than you ever would in having the fee. So we didn't understand that. Poor John, he was there for a year, and he was living there most of the time in a timeshare, and he was spending money like crazy. He was having a hard time getting, but John just never gave up. I mean, he was a true trooper, and he loved doing it. He just loved doing it. And then we met, following all of this, we met with Dr. Robert Sloan, who was president of Baylor University. And we met with his staff, and the goal was to take our collection to Baylor University. Truett Seminary had just completed, and the financial advice that they got from them, everything was going really great. We were making this presentation. Dr. Sloan was all excited, the people are all excited, and in walks the businessman. And the businessman said, "We don't have the money for that. Truett Seminary is taking our money now." So we didn't want to give it to him, so we decided that was not, and John began to pray. And so, as I said, his final idea was to have a full-blown museum that would have interactive things and so forth. So our dream, especially with John, I give John most of the credit for this. He was really the point man. But our final efforts came through Dr. Diana's husband, Gordon. He knew the president of Houston Baptist, and at this time, Dr. Sloan became president of Houston Baptist University, now Houston Christian University. And so John contacted him, and he was again excited about the collection. And so with the work of Gordon and Dr. Severance, we were able to get our collection to the Houston Christian University in the museum there. And we had a celebration of several months ago of the numbers of years that we had in there, and Dr. Sloan spoke, and some of the founding people that I didn't even know, who were the money behind building that museum and everything, were there, and I learned a lot about how that all got going. So that was an exciting thing, and as I say, that's my story. Hobby to heritage, and I'm sticking to it. I think if you've not read John's book he has a great book, and the second half of it is all about his journey in Bible collecting, and it's really fantastic. So you ought to try to get that. I think you can get it online, or they can get it from the museum. So that's it.
All right, well, thank you, Don. Appreciate your journey. So now we have some time if you want to continue looking at the different Bibles that people brought. Feel free to do that. And then our next event will be supper. And I think what we'll probably do is just go next door to Tiffany's, thank you. And just having a nice meal there, and then we'll come back and
Did you mention that there's coupons upstairs? Somebody mentioned.
Oh,
50%
there's
off.
coupons upstairs, right, for Tiffany's, so grab a coupon. Or if you want to go elsewhere, that's free. You're free to do that. And then we'll come back here. And somewhere between 7:30, Don will wrap up his last presentation this weekend. And I don't know about you, but I've really enjoyed those. And tonight, he's going to be taking us on some of his journeys, right? So he's gonna reveal all the secrets. So stay tuned for tonight. I think you'll enjoy that. And then tomorrow, again, we're gonna be going to the Newberry Library. We meet there at 10 o'clock, leave here about 9, and then we'll come back, have lunch, and then we'll close our day with our business meeting. Hopefully you'll stay for that. And I don't know, that'll probably be 40 minutes or so. And then again, you're welcome to stay around as much as you'd like, or if you need to leave, you can certainly do that. But so that's our schedule. So,
What time do y'all get together for walking over for dinner?
yeah, what time is it now?
16:28.
15:28.
4:30.
4:30. I'm just reading it. Yeah, I'm thinking. Okay.
You're on military time here.
It's a long story.
Yeah. So why don't we plan to head over there about 5:30,
So an hour.
about an hour from now.
We'll meet at the lobby in an
Yep.
hour. Okay.
Library an hour, and then we'll walk over, and then hopefully it won't take us more than an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. Come back here, and then Don will be able to share tonight. So thank you again, and we'll see you in the lobby at 5:30.
Okay.